Thank you for joining us today. This is our second part of the continuing the conversation, AI, artificial intelligence for audit committees. You can rewatch our first webinar, which Richard and Cory joined us on. That was in January. But not to worry if you didn't see it or listen to it. This will be standalone. We'll repeat a few things, but we're also going to talk about new things since then, since everything's moving so fast. As you heard, we will have 4 polling questions. So do make sure that you complete those so that you can get your CPE certificate. And we'll try to make time for questions. So please use the chat to answer your questions. And with that, I'd like to introduce our experts, our panelists. Thank you, Richard Jackson, for joining us from EY. Can you just briefly introduce yourself?
Thanks very much, Vanessa, and great to be with you again today. So Richard Jackson, I'm an audit partner from Ernst & Young. I'm also our global assurance AI leader based here on the West Coast in Silicon Valley. So excited to be here again to part 2 of the conversation.
Great, thank you. Really appreciate you making time for us. Cory from Microsoft.
Yeah, thank you, Vanessa. Likewise, I'm honored to be back again. It's hard to believe it's been already 10 months since we were here last. But Cory Hrncirik, I work in our finance department here at Microsoft. I've been here 16 years. And for the past 6, I've been coordinating our modern finance efforts in the office of our CFO, Amy Hood. And we are deep in implementing AI across our entire finance organization. So excited to be here to share some of that.
Yeah, thank you. And new to us is Tom Petro. Tom?
Thank you for that. Happy to be with you, Vanessa, and happy to join you, Cory and Richard. Excited to be a part of this today. I'm the boardroom practitioner here, 40 years of boardroom experience. I'm currently vice chair of an audit committee of a publicly traded company, and I'm a risk chair of a publicly traded company. I've had the privilege of leading 2 different companies as CEO, both public, and leading an IPO. So, and in my life as part of 1867 Capital Partners, we invest in early stage companies commercializing solutions in the AI space.
Great. And I know just enough to be dangerous. So I love doing this because I learn a lot, which is exciting. So if we could queue up the first slide. Give that a second. And if you could move, please, to the next slide. Disclaimer, and then yeah, this one. So Richard, we'll start with you. This is a landscape slide because one of the things I think, even though I suspect our audience is getting more versed on what generative AI is every day, it's still pretty new. And so I find that trying to understand the right nomenclature, kind of getting our heads around what it is and what it isn't, level setting is really part of the process that everybody's going through. So can you talk about this huge, broad topic of ours as you've depicted on this slide?
Yeah, absolutely. And this slide, you know, for those that are watching and following along, you know, fear not, we're not going to turn this into a history lecture. But, you know, the idea of this slide fundamentally is to show that a lot of the techniques and the technologies behind what we now call AI it has been around for a really long time. You can see it dates back to the 40s. And as you say, it has gone through and continues to go through a number of iterations as the technology evolves and as we've moved through this era of machines starting to learn, to be able to start becoming more self-learning in their application of knowledge. And then for many of us, it really didn't break onto the consciousness until, even though we've got generative AI on here as 2017, probably for most people, that aha moment came about 2 years ago, actually, this month, when ChatGPT released their version 3.5 of their technology. And that's when we all of a sudden had this explosion of really bringing this conversation to the fore. And that generative AI was so fundamentally different because it moved the technology from what was previously a very rule-based approach. We often talk about P times Q equals R. It was very what people call predictive, where you had a series of known outcomes, to this concept where the generative AI started to actually act with unpredictability. And we won't go into necessarily the algorithms and the technology behind the curtain, but what it started to do was to give you more custom answers and solutions that were actually not just built upon existing information, but actually added to that information. It actually started to have the ability to summarize large amounts of data or even narratives. It could understand language. It started to change the way in which we even interacted with the human, because you no longer needed to use coded language. You could just have a conversation like this. And so it really started to open up people's minds to the art of what was possible. And even in that 2-year period, for those that were on our last webcast earlier this year, we didn't even have that last circle on the page, this thing called agentic AI. So if you're following along and you're thinking, I've never heard that term, it's okay. We've put it there for a reason, because you will start to hear more of it. Some of you may already be familiar with it. But really, all that agentic AI is, one, it's demonstrating the speed at which the technology is evolving, and it's moving us in an environment where the technology isn't just responding to a question or a series of backwards and forwards questions with a human, but it's actually moving into more problem solving. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we drill into some use cases and examples today. But the simplest example I can give you is, in the past, we may have had applications or uses of the technology. For example, if you were trying to find travel arrangements, you were trying to find when's the next flight if you want to go to the East Coast. And it would bring back the information, and then you, the human, would have to do something with it. Well, agentic AI takes it to that next level, where you could actually, in the same kind of natural language discussion that I'm having now, say, I want to be in New York by Friday, and I want you to optimize for price over how long it takes me to get there. And what the agentic AI does is it takes that problem and it goes and solves it on your behalf. And it takes that nebulous or that fairly vague series of instructions and breaks it down into a series of tasks, and actually comes back with, here's your solution. I've got you on this flight, Richard, that optimizes for what you told me to. And that's a very different way in which the technology is evolving. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about how that may be applicable in the enterprise and how we see it coming back into the finance world and what it means to the world of audits and committees. But just to keep that concept, even if that still feels a little strange or unfamiliar to people, but it's just an example of how fast this technology has moved, even in the last few months, and the trajectory at which it will continue to move over the coming periods.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think the term agent, although like you said, when you shared the slides, that term agentic AI was new to me. Although I've heard agent used, I've also heard assistant used as sort of a term to help, I don't know, make the concepts a little bit more familiar. Cory, since we've talked to you last, in January, I want to say Copilot was just launching. Is that right?
In our finance division, that's right.
Right. So can you talk for our audience? I know this is a very broad question, but to expand on what Richard was saying, how do you think about generative AI when you're trying to explain it to either folks on your team or other stakeholders?
Yeah. I think it's a natural extension from Richard's amazing slide here. It really is, AI, we think about AI generally as a technology that we embed in every finance process across our entire landscape. So, and we use whichever tool makes sense for the job, so to kind of use Richard's diagram a little bit, I don't know that we go in specifically and say, hey, we just want to use only generative AI. We're keeping an open mind to recognize, we try to solve specific business challenges that we face, and we use whatever technology is best suited for that. Some of the solutions that we've developed with AI over the past 8 years are still very much in kind of the stage of continuous improvement. For example, case in point, machine learning time series forecasting is one of probably the biggest AI investments that we've gotten the most mileage out of. And it's something that generative AI doesn't do very well. We're still depending on a lot of the traditional regression-based models like ARIMA and exponential smoothing and other things. So I just want to call that out right up front, is that AI generally is helpful for finance. Generative AI, just to put a fine point on that, obviously, like the rest of the world, we only started using it in our finance group 18 months ago or whatever we said. some of the kind of tasks that we find are well suited for generative AI are obviously anything having to do with text. Generative AI is the realm of language models, large and small. And so it works really well. Some of the actual scenarios that we have production solutions built are in, for example, collections is a big one, for example, where we can analyze lots of emails and transcripts from our collections agents to try to get money in the door faster. We've cut that case resolution time down by 60%, going from something like 16 days to resolve a collection case down to about 6 at the time we made that snapshot. Now it's actually reduced even further, which means we can get money in the door faster. And that is a great use case for generative AI. There are many others, right? The way that we review documents and contracts for either revenue recognition purposes or for the purposes of reviewing contracts for a compliance purpose before the deals actually close. There's other scenarios, like a separate one is we own procurement within finance. Amy is responsible for procurement. And you think about when we do RFPs, we do thousands of RFPs. Each RFP traditionally takes up to a month to kind of get all the bids in and solve. We're cutting that in half by now analyzing all of those vendor and supplier proposals that we get back. And to Richard's point on agents, this is one of the areas where we're starting to really play around with this agents concept of, can we ask this AI engine to actually push a recommendation to us to say, for RFP 13356, here's our recommendation for the best vendor to fulfill this proposal. Alternatively, this is another vendor, and here's another vendor. Here's some similarities, and here's some differences. And so kind of giving us more of that, that recommendation or that proposal that we can act on much, much easier. So those are just a few examples. And then, of course, you've got Copilot usage that you called out, which is, boosting our individual productivity by having this assistant with us to help get things done. So it's a pretty exciting time to be in finance.
I think a lot of times I hear in different conferences and meetings that it's maybe hard to get started. I think some bigger companies, maybe they're rolling out some tools. If you work for a smaller company, maybe not as much. Tom, can you talk a little? I think most people know ChatGPT, which is open. But Tom, can you talk a little bit about kind of this concept of an open versus closed? GPT, if people like to say.
Yeah, so I think this is an important distinction. It's just one to pay attention to. The original ChatGPT that launched, and we had 100 million of us using it within the first 2 months, was a public model, still is a public model. They've come out with an enterprise version and a smaller Teams version since then. If they were available in January at the first session, and they were just hitting the market at that point in time. But since then, there's been actually a tremendous amount of progress over the course of the year with being able to get enterprise versions of these tools, which are, what do we mean by enterprise version? Is it's your own instance. So you can upload and share and wire in highly sensitive, confidential information to it, and know that it's not, the companies are not using that information to train their models, number one, and number two, that what you're sharing with it is not being exposed to the world, to your competitors, to other actors. And so that was something that we weren't talking about a year ago, but we're talking about it now all the time. And I think many of the largest companies have already taken up their own instance that is a private instance. And sort of the analogy that I use, if I used it this morning, was, look, if you want to, stand on I-95 during rush hour and take off your clothes, by all means do it, but do it with your own information. With my company information, keep it behind our firewall, keep it in our private instance. And so what does that mean? A fair amount of training has to go into that, right? Because people just don't, this isn't intuitive, you wouldn't know it. So we need to be encouraging our management teams to make sure that there is ongoing education and training for this. I think the other thing that I would add that's maybe new is, these models, including Copilot, have all gotten so much more powerful during the course of the year. And I think we're still in the top of the second inning. We're much closer to the beginning of the game than we are to the end of the game in terms of the power. And today, I would say that many of the tools that are available to us, like a Claude, a ChatGPT 4.0, or the Strawberry version, Copilot, the sophistication that's baked into them today is very much analogous to a first-year accountant. And Cory made the point of they're really great with handling text, and that's true. They're competent with technical details, but where they miss is nuance and context. And so it still requires human intervention. It still requires human in the loop, but the rough cutting that these things can do can literally shave hours and weeks off of a project. I mean, it's really amazing.
And we're going to do our polling question. If we could launch that now. Then I want, Tom, if you don't mind, to talk a little bit for a second about the prompt engineering tip that you have for our audience. So let's just do the polling question quick. So have you experimented with Gen AI? So these are the tools. I'll give that a minute and then we'll share the results so we can see. So while we're waiting for the results, Tom, can you talk about prompt engineering?
Yeah, so again, I'm not sure how much of this was term of the of the art back in January of this year, but it's certainly front and center now. And if you haven't engaged in a prompt engineering course, if your company isn't making that available to you, there are a number of really high quality free courses that can be taken. But the ability of think about your generative AI as a first year, right? And so the more direction you can provide in terms of setting the stage for the problem that you want this person to solve for you, the better they're going to be equipped to do that. And sort of the simple analogy that I would use is, you want to tell it that we're going to the frozen food aisle, because you're giving it context, and it says, okay, all right, now I know, all right, we're in the frozen food aisle. Okay, now what? And so we do the same thing in our when using the tool. If you can tell it, give it a persona. I want you to act like a highly seasoned, experienced project engineer that has an MBA degree, because I'm going to be asking you finance questions as well. And that is, as silly as that may sound, it actually sets the stage for deriving better answers.
Great. So can we please share the results of our polling question? So, I think we had this question back in January. This seems like a higher percentage from back then. I should have looked. I'm losing my audit skills, but that's interesting, I think, to see 75% have now experimented with it.
Vanessa, can I jump in?
Yes, please, of course.
I think just to build off what Tom described, a couple of things he mentioned that I think are really important. So, I strongly agree with his comments around that public versus private. And if I use EY as an example, we're a big partner of Microsoft, so not to give Cory too big a shout out, but we implemented about 2 years ago our own private version of OpenAI, so Microsoft's version of the Copilot technology. And we did it for exactly the reason Tom described, because we needed to bring it in-house. We needed to make sure that, because we talk about this technology is so democratized, it's literally on everyone's mobile device. And so we've moved, I think, and we've seen a lot of our clients move from a world where they first of all thought, we're just going to block it, to a realization you can't block it. So now you're back to Tom's, you're stood on the I-95, are you going to wear clothes or not? And so you rapidly moved into bringing it in-house and putting it into that environment where people could experiment. And just to kind of illustrate, because Tom's point about prompt engineering, you have to experiment with it. You have to actually just roll up your sleeves and try. We now in EY have 160,000 of our people using that private version every single month. Just within our assurance business, since we implemented it, we've had 19 million prompts. So just that extent of, and that's all in a sandbox, it's all experimentation, it's all managing data privacy, confidentiality, some of the things we'll talk about as again during the course of this webcast. But I think it just underscores Tom's point of, for organizations to lean in and understand that you have to experiment, you have to create the safe space within which your employee base can manage it and not be exposed on the I-95.
There's a question asking to repeat the EY statistics. Was it 19 million?
So 160,000 people using it every single month. And just within our assurance business, so again, assurance is one of our 4 business units, but within our assurance business, 19 million prompts in the last 18 months since we implemented it. So it just gives you that amount of energy and the willingness of people to experiment. And we'll talk a lot about, again, the human element of this, because it's not just a technology implementation, it's very much how does the human interact with the technology that's important.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to get into governance and risk. There's so much to talk about. I will say at a recent NACD summit, I listened to several different Gen AI panels, and not many of them were technical. A lot of them talked about culture, innovative mindset, generation, the way different generations, like very non-technical topics for, thinking about adopting. Cory, just briefly, can you talk, you already mentioned a few use cases, but can you just give a little bit more color, and then we'll move on to risks that audit committee should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'll just kind of piggyback on what Tom and Richard were just saying as well, because I think, the biggest thing that we're learning is that it really is it's one of these probably generational experiences that we're all going through, but we're so close to it that we don't even sense it. Like we keep reminding our people that most of them were not in the workforce when Excel launched in, I think it was 1985. So they don't remember that transition from kind of green screens and, kind of fairly, today, by today's standards, fairly remedial ways of doing finance tasks, to the spreadsheet, which revolutionized the way that we all work today. And we can't even imagine life without some kind of spreadsheet program. We really firmly believe we're in the middle of another one of those big shifts. And it is something that we all have to lean into. It doesn't happen naturally. What we find ourselves, to Richard's point, we've got in finance, we actually are some of the highest adopters of Copilot in Microsoft. Why is that, you may ask? I think it's because finance people are actually already quite good at using a tool like Excel to go problem solve and figure stuff out. And so you give them another possible powerful AI assistant and you teach them how to use it, and they can ramp up really quickly. But it's important to learn how to prompt, as Tom and Richard both mentioned. I'll throw out one little nugget. Our latest prompting efforts, we're trying to obviously build daily intentional habits of using Copilot with every task, but the latest really cool thing is that AI is really good at writing code, and code is really good at analyzing numerical data, and that's what we need. Large language models by default aren't good at numerical calculations, but code is. And so the coolest new stuff that we're doing right now in Microsoft is using the new embedded Python capabilities within Excel Copilot, for example, and just using natural language prompts, to Tom's point, to then write code to do some pretty complex analysis of data and visualizations and all kinds of things. And so we're just scratching the surface ourselves, but I mean, it is amazing what even junior analysts and senior folks can do by learning to prompt, and we're just getting started. So anyway, great. Does that help, Vanessa?
Yeah, no, I think it's great. I mean, I've heard for sure, and I've heard academics say this, I've heard, accountants say this, that there is at this point a need to, like Richard said, roll up your sleeves and experiment to some extent too. And I've heard people say, it's going to be a differentiator for companies and for you individually if you, learn how best to master this technology. Not that that's easy, but whether you make that proactive investment of your time.
And Vanessa, perhaps I can, again, give you an example from the audit world, which I think will help underscore some of the things that people are hearing. So I'll go back to the comment the guys made about the fact that think about this technology, at least today, as very much akin to a first-year associate, a first-year professional, a preparer, whether it's, in Cory's world of finance. And one of the things that most people can associate with is the good old financial statements in an audit or in a financial reporting. And many of us who grew up in the profession have been there, where you get the 200-page 10K or you get the 100-page 10Q, and whether or not you're the preparer of it, the reviewer of it, perhaps you're a board member being presented, one of the things your eyes always go to is, does this thing even add up? Do I have to go through and check that the number on the balance sheet agrees to the footnote? Well, guess what? In the same way that Cory described, with a little bit of experimentation, we built a tool that automates that. But what was really neat about the tool, and it goes back to the problem-solving thing, is we didn't actually have to tell it what a 10K is. What we did, we just presented it a document and said, what can you do with this? And what the AI did was it read the whole thing in nanoseconds. It went and then essentially taught itself what the 1933 and 34 Act says around SEC obligations, and came back and said, hey, I understand what a balance sheet is now. And first of all, I understand a balance sheet should add up and it should balance. And there's a whole bunch of numbers on the page. And so it recalculated all the numbers without us ever actually telling it that it had to do that. We taught it math, but we didn't tell it how to apply math. It then also said, hey, because I've read the rules and regs and I understand them, I also understand that inventory on the balance sheet should probably tie through to the footnote and the explanation of the breakout of that. And it automatically looks for those relationships and says, these numbers don't add up or these numbers don't compare. And so it's just a really simple, basic example. But for many of our youngest professionals, where they may in any ordinary financial reporting cycle have to go through 3, 4, 5 drafts of that, where they've previously been doing it manually, and suddenly you've sped up the whole process. It becomes, back to the comments about, it's not just a technology play. You can imagine how excited those young professionals are to now be able to leverage the tech in a way that's very intuitive. We fundamentally think it takes the quality up several degrees, and it starts to open up the door. And I'll come back to that agentic idea of imagining a world in which you can do that, where you can just give the technology the issue and let it problem solve for you of how to do those things.
And Richard, just to build on that, there's a question, and this is a little off script, but is EY using AI in performing actual audit procedures? And so that technology you're talking about, is that live in production yet?
So we call it the financial statement tie-out tool. Not particularly original, because we are accountants at the end of the day. But it's out there. It's deployed across all of our 125,000 audits, and that's still pretty much basic AI that we're talking about. We've got a large number of other tools in development that are more generative AI. Some of them go back, Cory, to your points around code and the ability to code. Those are coming to production and will be released into our practice over the next few weeks and months.
One of the things we've talked about in different task forces here at the CAQ is that for the audit, the auditor can only go as fast as the company. And so maybe we can bring up the next slide, which is slide 3. But, the data quality and the ability to harness data from the company that's being audited. I guess I just want to make clear, Richard, I think that's going to impact this, the auditor's ability to apply AI tools as the tools are evolving, but there's also going to be challenges.
Absolutely. And I think, for those that joined us in January, I think we talked a lot about that as, one of the turnkey issues for a lot of organizations is the technology, whether you're talking AI, Gen AI, whatever, it is always predicated on both the availability and the quality of the data that you can point that technology at. And candidly, a lot of organizations have found that they probably have some tech debt there because they may not have paid attention to it as much as they need to. And now that they look at the potential of what this technology can do, they can't quite unlock all of the value until they spend more time and attention on the data. So that is one of it's a very important, it's a very tactical and practical issue, but it also, and I know we've got some, some great questions and thoughts on slides here, it also goes to that level of the management focus areas, where they want to prioritize, how they accelerate or differentiate the use of the AI, as well as some of the questions and challenges that come in at the board level of how is the management team organizing for that, and how can the board lean in and help with some of that prioritization.
Yeah, it's really important, right, to build on that point, Richard. this is moving really fast. I mean, when we think about it, we're talking about things today that we literally were not talking about. We weren't even thinking about 10 months ago. And so to the extent that we as audit committee members or as assurance members, either outside or internal audit, we're to the extent that we're all trying to catch up and keep pace with this, we have to recognize that, you know, our management teams are doing the same thing. They're trying to keep up with it and trying to get ahead of it. And I would say most of us are not succeeding in that realm, and it's moving faster than we are. So, you know, one of the things, you know, to think about is, well, just how do you get your arms around this, you know, from an audit committee standpoint, and where can you really be helpful to your management team? And it seems to me like there's some pretty fundamental things that we want to focus on. First is, we don't have to reinvent the wheel here. We have really good enterprise risk management processes that are in place. They're, you know, either mature or not mature, depending on where your company is located. But as an example, most companies now have, you know, an expressed risk appetite. So take a look at that risk appetite statement in the light of the capabilities of generative AI and other types of AI. And you don't need to rewrite your risk appetite statement, but you need to strategically sort of lock arms with your management team and ask the question, how much risk are we willing to take with AI? And is that risk internal risk, or is it customer facing risk? And is our posture more conservative because we can't tolerate failure? Or is it more aggressive because we, and at least as it relates to our applications, we can tolerate failure? And what realm is that appetite applied to? Is it in our production processes, or is it in our laboratory? Because we'll all take more risk in our laboratory than in our production processes. So a lot of it is just having the conversations and making sure that there's alignment between the board and management team in terms of how are we all thinking about this. And then the execution of that from a risk standpoint, it should follow the frameworks that are already well developed. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We all have 3 lines of defense. So let's make sure that those 3 lines of defense are appropriately equipped with the knowledge, training, skills, tools that they need to be able to utilize these new tools in their work, but also inspect how these tools are being applied more broadly throughout the organization, whether it's for internal purposes or for customer facing and production purposes. And so I think it's more of feathering or layering in to what's already there rather than trying to start from the beginning. But having said that, I don't mean to minimize the amount of effort here, simply because AI in all of its forms, the more basic forms, you know, that were hidden behind our firewalls and user access controls, to the newer generative creative AI, brings a set of risks and risk factors that we typically don't deal with in our enterprise risk management frameworks, because we're used to dealing with those risks, and we know that are already part of our world. You know, we have a structure for incorporating these new risks into that. We don't have to start all over, but you still have to go through the process of understanding those risks, how they're going to manifest in your particular instance, and making sure that you're building the apparatus to engage thoughtfully throughout the assurance process.
Let me launch the next polling question, and then we'll continue on that thread. So our next polling question, if we could launch it, is, has your company implemented Gen AI in financial reporting or ICFR? And so while people are responding to that, one of the questions that we have, which is I think something we've talked about in our prep, is well, it's a little different, but it kind of gets to this idea of how can you rely on the AI output? So this is for Richard. What kind of new procedures documentation has to be put in place at the firm for the 10K example you had, when you've got a tool that does the tie out? And I guess I like this question because I think it gets to the broader question of the risk of interpretability, reliability of the outcomes. People probably heard a lot about hallucinations, those kinds of things.
Absolutely. Well, I love the question, because I think it does become a really good illustration of some of the things that Tom's mentioning, in that if you think about my example of that 10K tie out, at its heart, what the tool is doing is what our first years have historically done. And when you think about it through that lens, and I sometimes even get to that point where I say, let's give the tool a persona. Let's call it Jane or Fred or something else. Because if we describe the tool in that persona as a first-year equivalent, well, we know what to do under professional standards. We know what to do under the auditing standards and under our own governance around what do you do when a first year prepares something. Well, we have a detailed review by a senior, and then we have a general review by a manager. And so, and I think that analogy is very consistent with what Tom was just describing, which is when you understand the use case and the risk environment within which you put the technology, you probably already have existing frameworks that get you a large, not necessarily all the way there, but they get you a large way of the way there in terms of understanding now what do you do with it in terms of the guardrails, the compliance, the checks and balances in the system. It will also help you highlight where the gaps might be or where you need to kind of ratchet it up. So in my example, as I say, first year equivalent, yep, we literally treat it like a first year. We tell the senior has to do a detailed review, manager does general review. Now, as we evolve more complicated and more sophisticated uses of the technology, we will differentiate that level of review and supervision and re-performance of what the technology can do. Now, at the same time, we're going to increase the complexity and confidence we have in what the technology can do. So version 2 or 3 of my financial statement tool, well, now it's going to be Elijah, or now I'm going to run out of the names now. It's going to be Sarah. And Sarah's going to be a senior because we'll have trained her much more, and she will have become much more competent, qualified in what she can do. So future iterations of that technology, it may now be a senior level equivalent where it's both prepared it and had the capability to review it itself. And then the level of what we do on the back end will change over time. And I think that analogy is it works for us, obviously, within an audit environment, but the same goes through for organizations that are implementing this technology in their own environments, where it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach to how you think about risk and governance. It is going to be contextualized between the level of complexity that the technology has, as well as the importance or significance and the risk within which you use it.
Yeah,
and again, we'll talk a little bit about frameworks and things like that, of how do you solve for that. So, what do you do with that? But
yeah, let's launch the result of the polling question number 2. So 11% yes, and the rest NA, don't know. So not surprising that there is not as much implementation compared to experimentation, right? Cory, I don't know, did you want to build on the capability of sort of that, I'm going to call it auditability of the output?
Yeah, it's really important, actually. I'm glad that we're talking about it. We've definitely been on this journey for a long time. Even if I go back, 7-8 years ago when we started building Gen AI solutions, and then when AI became trigger for automated tasks. It's important when you build these kind of systems, and we're seeing the same things now as agents come online, that we need to be able to audit what the agent or what the AI method is, what's being deployed and what the outcome is. The great thing about building systems like this, however, is they generate for you logs, right? And so they are actually very auditable, which is great. That's great news. So a good example, like a real example, just to make it, more targeted, is we've been using AI now for 6 years maybe to automate invoice payments for Microsoft. We process 2 million invoice payments a year. They were all done manually in the past. Now about 50% have been automated using AI. And so we audit the AI algorithms that are identifying these low risk 50% of invoices, million invoices, and we automate the runs. So we can tell you, and with great kind of confidence, exactly what AI is doing and why it's doing what it's doing at every stage of the process. Agents will be very similar. Imagine, to Richard's example earlier of being able to create an agent and giving it kind of a set of instructions. But those instructions then will be, obviously you can edit the instructions, but then, and you can fine tune those obviously over time as your audit results start to, identify potential lapses or issues that you may have, because you can see the log of how the agent's performing each task, which is great. So I think there's some good things that are being built into these systems by all the big tech providers that will enable us to audit. But it's always important, to Tom's point earlier, you've got to have kind of this human oversight, all along the way. Richard's analogy of, treating the AI like a first-year associate is kind of spot on. It's the same thing that we're doing kind of in every application, every solution that we build as well.
Yeah. Or is it fair to say, sorry, John, but even since we last talked in January, and I think, Tom, we've talked about it as well, that level of transparency that the developers of the technology have built in to understand how the tool is problem solving, the sources of data it went to, the logic it has followed, the transparency and the visibility to see the breadcrumbs has improved a lot and will continue to improve. And to your point, the ability to go in and say, I understand your logic, but step 4, you got it quite wrong. So let's tweak that, let's train it. Improves the accuracy, it improves the auditability, it helps with that level of confidence. I mean, that's been a big change, I think, since we last talked back in January.
Well, because you hear a lot about it being probabilistic, correct? Not deterministic, if I have the words right. And so I've heard people say, if you were to ask the tool, the agent, I don't know if they're two different things, you would get different answers to the same question, because it will
nuanced. Although increasingly we're seeing the tools are building, again, it's application specific, but you're seeing tool makers build guardrails that can guide us towards more deterministic outcomes, which are really critical in our financial reporting world,
exactly.
right? You can't have a problem. There's a 60% chance that I have 100 million in revenue and a 20% chance that I have 102 million. No, that's not going to work. We need a number.
And a lot of that you can solve, to Tom's earlier point about with prompt engineering, right? Like you can tell these agents, you can be very specific, and you have to be very specific about what's allowed, right? You cannot hallucinate. These numbers have to be accurate. Like that's why we'll tend to kind of default to coding for any kind of numerical analysis, right? Because we can handle that numerical data a little bit more deterministically. But for other things, like if we're writing briefs or other things, we may want a little bit more probabilistic approach because we may want some options, right? We're doing that. I love Tom's analogy, actually, of that rough cut kind of thing, right? Like we kind of want some drafts. We want something to work with, and it's an easy tweak. So you have to kind of pick your direction.
All right, well, I want to make sure we get our polling questions in. So let's launch our third polling question. And this gets to what committee of the board has oversight of the use of GenAI, and we'll talk a little bit about this. So while folks are answering that, and in combination with this question, let's throw up the last slide we have, which is related to key risks. And so I think this weaves well into governance and oversight of AI, GenAI. So maybe, Tom, in your view, I know there's not a one size fits all answer, but like, what are the considerations? What are the things you think about in terms of the board level oversight?
So it's funny how this also has changed over the course of just 10 months, right? As the technology is moving as well. But I'd like to build off of the first slide and some of the points that Richard made related to our history lesson. Again, we're not going to focus on history, but I think it's important because Cory referenced it as well, is that, when we think about AI, let's set aside generative for a minute, there's a rich toolbox of AI tools that have been developed. That rich toolbox itself has been moving and growing with the addition of deep learning and the ability to plug neural networks behind these kinds of analytical techniques. And they're moving just as fast as the generative AI piece is in terms of their sophistication and capability. Again, these are the kinds of things that would have been highly engineered systems and solutions tucked behind firewalls and user access controls and the like, not the thing that has been democratized for the rest of us. But what I find really interesting is that the democratization piece, which has created an awareness in many boardrooms now about the power of AI, has actually caused those companies that have not traditionally engaged with some of the older machine learning techniques or perceptual intelligence types of AI capabilities are now beginning to ask the question, if we were to restart our company today, brand new, in light of the power that's available to us with these tools, what would we what would we do differently? How would we format our organization? How would we build our company? I think that's a really prescient question because, I think building off of what Cory said, we're living in this moment that's so rich and so ripe, we don't even recognize how rich and ripe the moment is. But I do think that it's one of these, I'm going to call it a Wayne Gretzky moment. For those of you that aren't hockey fans, famous Wayne Gretzky quote is that you have to skate to where the puck is going to be. And given that we are at the top of the second inning and that all of these tools are advancing very quickly, given that our children and grandchildren don't use keyboards, they talk to Siri and Alexa and expect to get an answer, given the agentic future that Richard has acquainted us with that's coming, the people that are going to be entering the workforce in 10 years from now are going to be entering a very different workforce than the one that we know today. And their workplace experience and the tools available to them are going to be very, very different. And if that isn't exciting and engaging and terrifying all at the same time, I don't know what is. So, so at least the boardroom conversations that I'm able to participate in are around the future focused questions and, how do we use it? How do we leverage these tools? What tools should we be leveraging? What thought processes or biases are we holding that's preventing us from seeing new and better ways of doing our business with the tools as they are today, let alone how they might be 2 and 3 years down the road? And the bigger risk, I think, and these are all very good risks, and this is a fabulous framework, by the way, but the bigger risk is not engaging with this technology, because I think that the only real risk is that you're too late to the party. And if you just think about for a minute some of the statistics that Richard shared about the use cases that are developing inside the EY corporation, think about the art of the possible that's coming because people are experimenting, trying, learning, failing, the cycle, rinse, wash, rinse, repeat, that you get to a point where his organization will have such a lead over organizations that are not providing their teams with the same ability to go through those rapid cycles that eventually the gap will be so great you won't be able to cross it. And so I think our biggest risk is not taking the tool seriously, not engaging with it, not trying to experiment. And maybe the difference, generative AI from traditional AI. I would say at a boardroom level, traditional AI, big, expensive, engineered systems, they definitely have to be top down in an organization. They have to be aligned with your strategy. They have to be funded. You have to be very thoughtful about that. But when it comes to generative AI, I think you've heard both Cory and Richard say this without using these words. These are small pond opportunities. They're going to lead to some really big oceans, but start in small ponds. You don't have to boil the ocean. Just go try to make it work on a on one of your footnotes and see what happens and learn from that, and then try it again and then try it again. So it's small pond, not big pond.
Great. Let's launch the polling results to see what folks say in terms of oversight full board 22%, audit committee, risk, technology, and other. Yeah, so a little bit across the board right now. I'm sure that'll continue to evolve. I want to throw out a couple questions with the time we have left, and then we'll do another polling question, because I think it's actually, if we could have that slide back up for a second, sorry, just because there's a lot of good information on it, and this will kind of go to it a little bit. There is a question that says, what do you consider that is critical to be addressed in a corporate AI use corporate policy? And the separate question is, what does AI mean for identifying potential financial frauds? I know those are two different questions, but in terms of corporate, I don't know, Richard, if you could, what your thoughts are on the corporate AI use policy.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I thought I probably should drop the mic after Tom's comments because I think he nailed it. But I think that corporate policy question goes to the heart of what we've got on the left-hand side here, which is, regardless of where you are as an organization, you need some kind of framework to get going. You need some framework within which all of the things Tom described, whether it's a top-down or a combination of top-down, bottom-up, and meet in the middle, organizations need, I call it a framework versus a policy, but a framework to get started with, to bring cohesion to the organization, because it's not going to be owned by just one group. We've moved from a world where this just sits within a legacy to IT organization for all the reasons we've been talking about today. And so you need to bring people together with a coherent roadmap, if you like, of how to think about all the risks, the challenges, and especially the opportunities. And that's what that graphic on the left-hand side is really trying to show. And you'll see data is in there at the heart. We talked a little bit about that earlier around its importance as a turnkey for the acceleration. But it also goes through a whole series of things, including just the human motivation for change and how you manage that within an organization. Then at a practical level, you have this concept on the, how do you move from it just being a framework or a policy that sits on the shelf to something that the organization actually makes real? And again, I think this very much interplays with some of Tom's comments around where the board can lean in and help the management team with advice and practical guidance, as well as oversight on that. But it really is starting basic. Do you even, can you begin to, first of all, implement a framework? And these aren't necessarily sequential in order on the right-hand side. Can you even begin to start building an inventory of all the places across the organization where you're using AI? Because we haven't really talked about regulation today, but many people are aware that the European Union passed the AI Act. It's now law. It is enacted and will become a reporting requirement for a lot of organizations, especially those that are multinational and have operations in Europe. So it's a cross-jurisdictional obligation. You can't begin to even think about compliance with that law and regulation unless you know all the places that you're using AI, and then you've gone through a thoughtful process of risk assessing it to determine whether or not you're compliant. And again, not to go down a regulatory landscape, but we're going to increasingly see huge amounts of not dissimilar forms of legislation, whether it's here in the US at the state level. Many people have seen the headlines over the late summer. California passed legislation, Colorado's looking at legislation, New York's. We could go on, but all of that comes back to, you can't begin to understand whether it's the strategic impact of the organization, the human disruption element to the workplace, the compliance and legal and regulatory compliance, unless you've got a coherent framework to start with. This is ours. I think a lot of organizations will have their own versions of it. Cory, I know you and I have talked about the fact that Microsoft has its version of this as well, and it becomes very much the DNA of what the organization needs.
Yeah, can I just mention, I mean, this slide is a gold mine, by the way.
I think it's a great slide, yeah.
If you don't have something like this already in place for your organization, definitely encourage you to do this post haste. It's very much aligned with our Microsoft internal responsible AI framework, and the way Tom and team have laid it out here is perfect. I mean, we talk about transparency and sustainability and compliance and security, and all these things are within our responsible AI framework, which we've been updating now more frequently than we have in the past 10 years. So recently, new things have come online. For example, facial recognition is a big thing that we've updated ourselves internally. How do we treat that kind of data? And there's many, many other typical, kind of things that we need to look at.
Awesome. And we'll have some takeaways after this, these slides. We've got some resources since we talked in January from the CAQ on generative AI. Let's launch our last polling question if we could, and I think we can take this slide down. And the last polling question is, has the audit committee of your company discussed AI with management or the external auditor in the past 12 months? So just curious what's happening there. And then in the few minutes that we have left, Cory, can you talk for a minute about what is a use case related to potential financial fraud?
Oh yeah, that was a good question as well. We have many AI applications in our audit risk and compliance department here at Microsoft. So there are quite a few. I mentioned one in passing in terms of compliance. One of the things that we implemented many years ago and have continued to fine tune is by identifying potential fraud in closing transactions, right? Microsoft closes thousands of transactions a day. Some of those are done by our internal salespeople. Others are closed by our partners where we don't have as close of oversight. And so we built AI listening systems to actually review all of these transactions as they're entered into a pipeline, our sales pipeline tool in CRM. And then we can identify those that need further review, additional human oversight. That's something we've been doing for 6 or 7 years now, and it works really well. Other things are using AI to identify proof of execution in a retail setting, for example, vendors submitting pictures and maybe using duplicates, or using something that they clipped themselves from some other site, or lately even using LLMs to audit other LLMs is actually quite a new technique now. The ability to actually use AI to audit AI. And you can even see this yourselves in kind of a small form. If you use Copilot, let's say, or any AI application to write something, and then use Copilot to actually audit or edit and critique the first output, right? That's actually a really good kind of best practice to get into anyway. Don't just take the first thing that AI gives you, but actually ask another instance to evaluate
like the first year associate and the senior and the manager, those iterations.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well,
So those are a few little principles, but we have others if people are interested.
Thank
you.
I
heard
and I know
something
there's so much
yesterday
more.
that actually scared me. It actually scared the bejeebers out of me. This was through the American Bankers Association and one of their feeds, and it was a case out of Asia where there was a $25 million corporate wire transfer fraud, and the wire transfer fraud began with an email purportedly from the boss saying, "Hey, there's this urgent transaction. We need you to do this." The employee thought, "Now this doesn't seem right. This feels fishy to me." Before the employee had a chance to follow up on it, got a link to a Zoom meeting. Join the Zoom meeting. Here's the top management talking about it. Used that link, joined the Zoom meeting, saw the Hollywood squares like we have gathered here, and meeting concluded about the transaction, and he went and he launched the wire transfer. And it turned out that the Zoom meeting was comprised of 4 deep fakes. None of them were real voices pirated from the real people, images of the real people that were the seniors in the organization. And that really just sort of caused the hair on the back of my neck to raise up. And my wife and I then had a lengthy conversation about, well, would we have been wise enough to figure out in that moment, let's go out of bandwidth? Like, wouldn't the Zoom meeting be considered out of bandwidth in that moment? And so I just think that one of the things that we have to recognize from a fraud and security perspective is just that this technology is enabling capabilities that we never dreamed of.
Yeah, so there's increased risk, there's increased capabilities for detecting it on both sides of it. Of course, Richard, we know as auditors, professional skepticism and all the core critical thinking skills are going to be more important than ever. I know we're over time, so just one quick minute. Let's launch the last, just out of curiosity, what were the results of our last poll? And then we'll do so 32% yes for both, some no, some don't know. Okay, so probably we'll see that continue to increase. Let's just do a really quick round robin key takeaways. Richard, what's your key takeaway for the audience?
I think it is, don't be intimidated by the technology, lean into the conversation, start from where you know you are. We've talked a lot about whether or not you're a board member, an internal auditor, an external auditor. We all know something about risk. We all know about managing change. Just lean into the conversation and kind of act boldly and experiment.
Great. Cory, how about for you?
I'll echo something similar. I mean, the AI moment is upon us. And so I think it's up to all of us to really invest time to learn, to exercise a growth mindset like we never have before in our careers. But also, I think everybody on this call has a great opportunity to help safeguard our own internal confidential information and ensure that our companies can move fast, but in a secure and compliant way.
Yeah. Tom, how about for you, the last word?
Yes, so yes and yes, exclamation point, double exclamation point. And one of the most valuable things you can do as an audit committee member is to engage with your management team around conducting a readiness assessment. Even if we already have things underway, it's that step back and let's create the framework for our organization to think through how we might engage in this moment and try to leverage it going forward. And it's mostly about the conversation and about the alignment with the management team.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all so much for joining me today and for our audience for joining me. I know there's so much more we could have talked about. So, just encourage everyone, like you said, to get out there and read the resources that are available. And again, hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you.